Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today I'm joined by well-known journalist, writer, and television host, Steve Paikin. Steve writes for TVO, hosts the On Poly podcast, and is the host of the well-regarded TV show, The Agenda with Steve Paikin, which is an institution in Ontario political circles. He's hosted election debates, and he's written several political books, including his latest, Paikin and the Premiers, which details his personal reflections on a half-decade of Ontario premiers. Steve, it's a real pleasure to have you on the program today. Thanks for joining us.
Mitch, not at all. Thanks for asking. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, so you're the perfect guest that I could think of to have on to start our second season of the podcast here, because our season opener in September here coincides perfectly with the return of the Ontario legislature after what could only be described as a really eventful first 2 years of the Ford government's mandate. So we had obviously his election back in 2018, a first year trying to wrangle a deficit, make some tough decisions, navigating through a pandemic, of course, in this year. So as someone who's covered a number of different governments and administration at Queen's Park, just got to ask you, what do you make of the first half of the Ford government's administration, and particularly the Premier's performance so far?
Well, I guess I'd answer that a couple of different ways. Number one, it's unprecedented, right? I mean, no Premier of Ontario in 100 years anyway, so certainly nobody in our lifetime has ever had to deal with the after effects of a global pandemic, and that is obviously unprecedented for anybody who's listening to this right now, unless they're 100 years old. The second thing is I tend to break up the first half of Doug Ford's premiership into two parts. There was sort of BP and AP. So before pandemic, I think there was a consensus out there that it was a bit of a disaster. That everything that kind of could go wrong did go wrong. There were numerous mistakes made, perhaps not surprising for a guy who'd, only been in provincial politics for a few months before the election. But AP, after pandemic, I mean, every public opinion survey I've seen, Mitch, since then says that most people are pretty happy with the way that the Premier has led during the course of this. Not perfectly, obviously, but when you compare what's gone on in Ontario to other jurisdictions, not badly at all. So I guess if we're going to talk about his administration, maybe BP and AP is the way to do it.
Well, it's funny because when you mentioned before pandemic, it strikes me, and obviously I was working for the Premier at the time, and a full disclosure in that first portion before the pandemic, and it's a tough job to learn about as you go. It's a tough thing to learn on the job and be Premier of the province at the same time. So, are there other administrations you've covered or other premiers that you've covered that have gone through that similar learning curve that Premier Ford has gone through in that first year?
Sure. And I guess the best example would be probably Bob Rae, who got elected Premier, funnily enough, I think 30 years ago this month. Bob Rae, although he had been in public life for certainly a considerable period of time, he'd had no experience in government at all. And let's make the comparison. I mean, let's go back to the 1950s. Leslie Frost had been around. He understood. He won 3 majority governments in the 1950s. Again, his successor, John Robarts, had been Minister of Education. He had experience in government. His successor, Bill Davis, had been Education Minister for about 8.5, 9 years. So again, during the 1960s, lots of experience in government. And you can go on, most of the people who eventually get to that job have either some cabinet experience or at least some experience in provincial politics. David Peterson was an MPP for 10 years before he assumed the premiership. Doug Ford had, 3-4 years on Toronto City Council as the sum total of his political experience before he became leader of the PC party. And then when he did take over the premiership, really no personal hands-on provincial experience to draw upon. I guess I would make somewhat of a comparison to Bob Rae. I know he had lots of time as an elected official before that, but none at all in government. And not only that, very few friends who had any experience in government also. I mean, he'd had to go outside the province, Bob Rae did, to get some advice from people like, Roy Romano or Alan Blakeney or this kind of, to get some understanding of how an NDP government operates. So I think that's part of what, and maybe you guys felt this. I kind of want to turn the tables and ask you, when you took over the keys to the legislature in June of 2018, I can just imagine that some of those first meetings were, okay, where are the bathrooms around here? And, how do we do this? And how do we set up that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really perceptive point. I mean, because the point that I would make is obviously, the premier himself didn't necessarily have the provincial experience, which can be accommodated for and learned over time. But the PC party had been in the wilderness for 15 years. They'd gone through numerous different leadership changes, numerous staff changes. Even though they had the government had a really good breadth of experience and talent to draw on for cabinet ministers, you got to remember that only 2 of the ministers that were in that very first cabinet had ever been in a cabinet meeting before.
Well, and I go beyond that, Mitch. I'd also say, for whatever reason, the premier picked a chief of staff who had also a similar, non-existent amount of provincial political experience, or let's put it this way, certainly not in a decision-making capacity or in a senior advisory capacity. And, I think that mix of the premier's lack of experience and his chief of staff's lack of experience, coupled with an approach to handling issues that was, shall we say, not constructively disruptive, but rather, well, I don't know how you want to describe it, but it was disruption for disruption's sake, and it was like picking fights with everybody with no apparent strategy or coherence in mind. And, surprise, surprise, Doug Ford was as unpopular in a matter of a few months as Kathleen Wynne was after 4 years.
Yeah, I think it's, from a staffing perspective, it's extremely hard to capture 10 to 15 years of history, stakeholder opinions in 1 page of a briefing note or 2 pages of a briefing note, right? So
Sure.
When you're dealing with something I can think of as historical and as deep-seated as the Francophone position in Ontario, and you want to make a decision about that university, it's pretty hard to capture that in a meeting and just verbally relay the importance of an institution like that to a community and have someone understand. So yeah, that context is really important to gather, and it's been interesting now that not only has the premier been able to gain some experience, but the cabinet's been able to gain some experience, and then tasked with navigating this mandate. And you mentioned the public opinion research, the popularity, the approval rates of the premier personally seem to be pretty high, and of the government more generally seem to be pretty high as well. So, you've written, I found it really interesting, you wrote a couple of weeks ago that the format of daily news conferences, the lack of scrums with the media has really helped the premier sort of come into his own. How do you think he keeps that momentum going into this sitting of the legislature and the sort of second half of the mandate?
Well, it seems to me that authenticity is the coin of the realm these days in politics. And if people think you're being a phony, if that bridge of trust that you have developed between yourself, your government, and the public starts to erode, then you've got a problem. And the one thing that the premier seems quite adept at being able to do is to demonstrate that, what you see is what you get. He is who he seems to be. He manages to demonstrate on a regular basis a connection with, as I like to put it, Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario. They get a feeling that he's out there for them, that he's not sort of running a government, trying to keep them at bay, but he actually understands, it's that old Bill Clinton line, I feel your pain. You get the sense that he does. And again, we go back to BP and AP. Before the pandemic, for whatever reason, Doug Ford used to, I don't know, it was a case of just lack of experience or thin-skinned or what, but he seemed to be constantly fighting and being very obstreperous with members of the media who were asking quite reasonable questions about how he was making decisions that he was making. He was constantly getting into fights with opposition politicians as well. And by that, I mean like belligerent fights. And now AP, after pandemic, he seems to be a totally different guy. I never thought I'd live long enough to hear it, but during the course of his daily briefings, he frequently says, "Oh, that was a great article you guys had in the Toronto Star, and I saw that, I read that, and I told my staff to follow up on that." And that's nothing I ever thought I'd hear this premier say. When he gets criticized by union leaders or by opposition leaders, he treats it in a wholly different way right now. It's almost like water off a duck's back. I don't know what your take is on that, Mitch, but it feels to me like he expresses more regret and disappointment as opposed to using it as an opportunity to continue a fight or one up a fight or that kind of thing. And well, look, Raes ipsa loquitur, right? The thing speaks for itself. Look where his polling numbers are today. Look how his change of approach has increased his popularity. Look how not trying to pick a fight with every single person around every corner has changed how the people of Ontario regard him. it's working.
Yeah, I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? I mean, the thing I've always said with Doug Ford is that in order to have this persona and this public image where you're standing up for the little guy and standing up for, as you kind of put it, Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontarian, you have to be standing up against something, against someone. There has to be some enemy out there. And in the election campaign, that was simple. It was obviously, from the Premier's perspective, the Kathleen Wynne Liberals. And frankly, they were a fairly universally disliked opponent. So he was on the side of the Angels in that. But when those enemies became, or those people that he was fighting against became not so universal, things like the teachers' unions or things like that, that popularity wanes a bit. And now I think what Doug's really benefiting from, what the Premier's really benefiting from, is that there's a universal opponent again, and that opponent is the virus. There's not a single Ontarian who's on the side of COVID. So when you're taking measures and fighting something that's universally disliked, like as he phrased it, the sort of yahoos on the front lawns of Queen's Park, that really gets that popularity back and up and running again, because people could clearly see he's fighting for them compared to maybe not fighting for me. And so, I think that's a really interesting perspective, the way that you've looked at it, because he does need to have that sort of that boogeyman to push against. Otherwise, he can't really fight for the little guy.
Yeah, and what I found absolutely fascinating is that, and I've never really liked this comparison too much to begin with, even BP, even before the pandemic. But it's a natural one. I mean, there were two significant populist leaders over the last few years that have captured the attention of a lot of Ontarians. One obviously was Doug Ford, and the other was Donald Trump. And both men got elected to upset the status quo. Both men got elected as outsiders. Both men got elected to try to disrupt the establishment. Both men insisted they were going to do business differently. A huge difference in the comparison, of course, is that President Trump seems to demonize, quote unquote, the other, whereas Doug Ford, I've never felt that about him. I've always felt that minority communities, people of color, and so on were actually, to some extent, part of his coalition. So, and I just never got the sense that he intended to demonize the other in the way that Donald Trump does. But having said that, then the pandemic hit. And what did Trump do? Trump stuck with his tried, tested, and true, and look where they are today. I mean, the numbers down there are just appalling, and he has really failed to rise to the occasion in a way that Doug Ford has. And Doug Ford, I don't know if he made a conscious decision or it's just something happened. Clearly, something happened. Either he's taking advice differently, or I don't know. I'd love to talk to him about it, but unfortunately, they are. Every time I ask for an interview, they always say the Premier's unavailable. But I would really love to get to the bottom of why he changed, how he managed to rise to this occasion, and what happened. I mean, I know he got a new chief of staff, but that happened well before the pandemic kicked in, and he was still getting himself into some difficulty even then. I don't know. I'm you know him a lot better than I do. I'm curious as to why Trump has been such a failure. And sort of so often disregarded the advice of experts who can help you get through this thing. And if you manage it well, you will reap the political rewards. Why Trump has ignored all of that, whereas Doug Ford has clearly gone in the other direction and said, I am moved by the experts. I am listening to the experts. I believe in science. And you're quite right when he took a shot at those yahoos, as he called them, on the front lawn of Queen's Park. That was him saying, "I know you guys are part of my base, but you're being really stupid right now." I don't know. I'd be interested in your view on how he managed to turn that around. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I would place part of it at the magnitude of the conversations, right? There's no there's no shortage of experts on pretty much any issue who could come out and offer their opinion. And I think back to something as small as the government cut a funding program for tree planting, and made the argument that the private sector was doing that in the forestry industry, and I think it saved $1 million or a few $1 million a year. That was controversial, but now when you're talking about billions of dollars of relief, billions of dollars of money in the pandemic, the $1 million tree planting money just doesn't seem to be as important anymore. And so
Totally.
I think the premier's kind of put it all in perspective, and that's let him really pick the battles that he needs to fight, and know where he needs to sort of concede a little bit more, and that's something that he didn't necessarily have in the early going. He didn't necessarily have that sense of magnitude and that sense of where people's priorities laid. And so I think it really has helped them. But I want to ask you in particular, because I think you're recording this from Manitoulin Island today, and so and in your show, in the agenda, you've actually made a point of not only covering rural issues, things like agriculture or manufacturing outside of the downtown GTA, but you've also specifically gone to cities, I think like Guelph and Barrie, done local profile pieces, that sort of stuff. TVO's mandate is, of course, the O stands for Ontario. And so you do a lot of work all across the province. And when you talk about Mr. and Mrs. Everyday, I'm going to guess if you were to say where they lived, it probably would be somewhere outside of the city. And so there's always been this historic sort of rural-urban divide in Ontario. And I'm wondering, what do you make of that divide right now? Do you think it exists? Do you think the pandemic has changed it at all? And just where do you see that issue in Ontario? Because to me, that's one of these underlying themes that people just don't seem to talk a lot about these days.
Well, it does exist, of course, and the premier has understood that it did exist, and had to wrap his head around it, because, as you point out, I'm on Manitoulin Island right now, and there's no COVID-19 on Manitoulin Island. And yet, it's funny, when you go out there, I mean, I'm in a village of 100 people, and when you go to the general store I was going to say downtown, that's not really downtown, but you know what I mean. There's a lot of mask wearing. There is terrific adherence to protocols and mask wearing here. And, the fact is, this is not like downtown Toronto. This is a very sparsely populated place, and people probably don't even need to adhere to the protocols as much as they are here, and yet they're doing it. So, to be sure, the big cities, the GTA and Ottawa, are hugely different from, let's just say, the rest of the province of Ontario. I have to be candid with you here. Not that I haven't been all the way along, but Mitch, one thing I've never understood, maybe that's the way to put this, I have never understood why the rural-urban divide in Ontario is as hard as it is, because there is so much interconnectedness between the two. And by that, I mean, I know there is a sense outside the capital city that everything is done for Toronto. I know that sense exists. And of course, Ontarians outside Toronto are united and unified by their hatred for the capital city. I get that. But there are a lot of people in this province who live in cities, but who can't wait to get out of those cities and go to rural Ontario to get away from all of the things about city life that can be overwhelming at times. And in fact, dive into so many of the wonderful things about rural life that they need to fill their souls from time to time. I'm a great example of it. I spend lots of time, obviously, in the middle of the biggest city in the country. TVO's headquarters and where I live are right in the middle of Toronto. And it's all very, under normal circumstances, very exciting and lots of stuff to do, et cetera, et cetera. But I can't wait to get out of town. I can't wait to get up here. And I'm 8 hours away, so it's a long way away. It's pretty remote. And I love it this far remote. And I don't know, it would seem to me that there's a natural bridge between urban and rural in this province that ought to exist. I don't know why it doesn't exist more. Maybe you've got some theories on this. It ought to exist because we need each other. We need the cities to have the economies that go gangbusters, to create the wealth that can help create programs that are helpful to rural Ontario. And we need rural Ontario to, not just obviously for the people who live there and the wonderful lifestyle it provides to them, but also as a place where, the premier's got it himself. The premier loves to get out of the city as well and go to his place, as he famously did one time in the midst of this pandemic. So I don't know. Have you got some theories as to why this bridge isn't stronger? I always thought it should be, but I don't know.
Well, it's one of these funny debates, right? Because I grew up in rural Ontario, and anytime you talk to
where'd you grow up?
In Oro-Medonte, between Barrie and Orillia.
Okay.
So some people may not define it as rural, but I certainly do.
It's not downtown, that's for sure.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's a consensus of, why do my tax dollars go to Toronto, right? And I think, when the Premier announced his $28.5 billion plan for subways and higher order transit, I think that was a lot of the message outside of the GTA was that's a lot of money to be spending on places that aren't me. But at the same time, I don't think the tax base on Manitoulin Island is supporting the provincial infrastructure that gets people to and from it, right? Highway 11 cannot be paid for just by the taxpayers of Orobadante. It needs more than that. And so you're right. There is an interdependency. I think one of the things, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on how this pandemic might be different and this recession might be different, is that it seems that rural Ontario is the first one out the gate, right? They're the ones to always get the worst of it. I think of, the 08-09 recession, Northern Ontario still to today has not gotten back the number of jobs that it lost during that recession. It's still below employment levels of where it was at that time. And so I think, when you make the drive to Manitoulin Island, you pass a lot of those blue town signs that are supposed to be cities or supposed to be communities and just aren't anymore. There are a few hundred people instead of a few thousand. And so these rural communities, they seem to, I don't know if die out is the right word, but they seem to bleed over time. And I think there's a resentment there that they sort of stagnate or get smaller. Well, the city obviously grows and gets a lot of attention. And I'm wondering if you think that this particular pandemic, with the sort of flight out of the city a little bit, with this idea of working remotely for the first time, if rural Ontario and Northern Ontario is poised for a comeback at all.
Well, I don't know if I'd say comeback, but I'd say it certainly has its chance in the spotlight as never before. And, one of the podcasts I love listening to is The Hurly Burly by David Hurley, who's, I guess, one of your liberal opposites. And I presume someone you have gone to political battle against from time to time in the past. David says on his podcast that he's been holed up wherever his cottage is. It's certainly well outside Toronto ever since this pandemic hit. He was there when it started and he just didn't come back to Toronto. And boy, if you want an argument to improve the bandwidth in rural Ontario so that not everybody has to work out of downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa, and that you can, in fact, spread the population over the province, distribute it more evenly. Boy, this is the time to make that argument because, that's a natural alliance right there. You've got people from urban Ontario who are now spending a lot of time in rural Ontario. And again, I'm an example of it. Once it became apparent that if we wired up this cottage, which had never really been wired before, we really never had Netflix, never had TV, never had any of that stuff here. Once we realized that we could get the place wired, and I could, for example, talk to you on a podcast, through technology, thanks to enhanced broadband, we didn't have to race back to the city to get our work done. We could stay away, which not only, was I happy to do, but my employer's happy too. We're not allowed back in the office.
Right.
I don't know what your situation is at Strategy Corp, but we there's basically a virtual ban from employees coming into the TVO headquarters right now. If you're not involved in either directing or hosting or shooting a show that day, you can't come in. Even producers are producing everything from their homes. So you've put your finger on a great issue where urban and rural can come together in a quest for, better internet service, better broadband, and in doing so, we can help convey the not convey the impression. We can actually make it happen that not all the services have to go into the cities. That we can start to build up the rest of the province too, which would be a good thing.
And it makes the political priorities of rural Ontario or the policy priorities perhaps a little bit more well known among the rest of the province, right? Which means, if a government's going to make an investment in broadband, it won't just be those rural communities saying great idea. You could have, downtown Toronto residents saying about time. So I've always been a fan of awful segues. And so we're talking about how to grow the economy in rural Ontario. Something else that needs to grow in rural Ontario is the Liberal Party of Ontario. They've recently elected Stephen Del Duca as the leader, is obviously a former cabinet minister and a former MPP, but no longer holds a seat in provincial parliament. I'm wondering, how do you think the Liberal Party grows outside of its downtown cores, where it's remained a bit strong, and kind of gets back to that popularity in sort of the mid-urban, suburban style of riding that it used to hold so prominently over the first part of the 2000s.
Well, let's remember, everything in politics is cyclical. And I remember a time, and admittedly, it's a long time ago, we're going back probably 5 decades, when the Liberal Party, it was a rural rump in much of Ontario. They had seats in Owen Sound and southwestern Ontario. And, there was, the biggest problem with the Liberals back in the day, and I'm going back even, Bill Davis and prior, one of the biggest problems the Liberals had was they couldn't win any seats in any cities. I mean, in 1981, in Bill Davis's last election in which he won a majority government, the Liberals won 2 seats in the city of Toronto. And then, of course, things changed. And I think the late Stuart Smith and then David Peterson helped usher in a sort of an understanding that cities, the most of the votes were in the cities, and the Liberal Party had to say something to city dwellers, or else they were going to continue to be in the wilderness. And so that changed. And then we got to a spectrum where, I mean, you saw this very well, where the Progressive Conservative Party, I think for 4 straight elections, did not win a single seat in the 416 during a general election, just one during a by-election. I mean, that's astonishing. It's astonishing that you could, let me do the math quickly in my head here. There's something like 23 seats in the 416, and you went 0 for 4, 0 for 4 elections. So that's like 0 for 96 or something like that, right? 96 possible seats, and you won none of them. And the pendulum swings again. Now the Liberals find themselves in a situation where under Dalton McGuinty, where they did win lots of suburban and some exurban and even some rural seats, being in government means making hard decisions. And of course, the pendulum swings back, and suddenly the Liberals find themselves nowhere in probably 2/3 of the ridings of this province. And when I mean nowhere, I mean like no infrastructure, Mitch, nothing. Like they don't have presidents of riding associations. They have, they have in essence no organization on the ground in at least half to 2/3 of the ridings of this province. And I think that's one reason why Stephen Del Duca was so successful in winning his convention on the first ballot, is that he really made the argument that the next leader of the Liberal Party will have the worst inbox of any leader in Ontario Liberal Party history. And that's true. I mean, no leader started from so far behind the start line as Stephen Del Duca, right? He's got to find more candidates than any previous Liberal leader has ever had to find. He's going to have to raise more money, if you like, draw more blood out of more stones. And ironically, we'll have a harder time doing it because of the more stringent fundraising regulations that were put in by his predecessor, Kathleen Wynne. So, it's an absolutely daunting challenge. Now, having said that, he's got one really important thing going for him, and you probably know this too, which is most Ontarians, when they get up in the morning and brush their teeth and look into the mirror, see a Liberal. Right? That is not to say that these people vote Liberal all the time, but the largest chunk of Ontarians tend to see themselves as small L Liberal in thinking. No less a conservative than Greg Lyle told me that. So I heard it from him, and I believe it. And so, he's got a decent base from which to rebuild his party. It will take an enormous amount of work. But he won because he was able to demonstrate that he's certainly willing to take on that challenge. And, obviously we're less than 2 years away from finding out how successful he'll be at it.
Well, I think that's a great point, because it's one of the things internally, being in the party provincially for 5 or 6 years, working there, and now a year or so afterwards. I always used to say to people there was this, I'll call it sort of a hangover. Obviously, there was 42 years of straight conservative governments in the mid and late 1900s, and that gives you a default sense that you're the natural governing party of the province. And that was certainly true then. There's no question about it. 42 years of consecutive governance would prove that. But I think that wind has shifted and it's changed. And the natural governing party in Ontario is, generally speaking, the Liberal Party. And so if you can think that way, it really helps you as both a conservative movement and a Liberal movement to understand where voters are at, how to tap into them, and what priorities people are going to bring forward to the ballot box. And I think you're right. Del Duca's got a big task ahead of him. He does have some advantage, to be honest, by not having a seat. It's not all a one-way scale there. He has the ability to travel the province whenever. The pandemic obviously is making that a little bit more difficult, so interesting to see. But I do contrast that to where the NDP stands in Ontario right now, because obviously Andrew Horwath is a well-known name, has been around for a while, has a seat in the legislature, nothing to worry about on that side of things, official leader of the opposition. But yet, despite those sort of institutional advantages that party and that leader may have over Del Duca and the Liberals, a tough time converting that into a message that sort of resonates with a broader public. And I'm curious, seeing the NDP perform well last time, but still not make it over the hump. What do you think they have to do a bit differently to try to get to that next level?
You know, you're asking me to offer political advice in that case, and that's something I just don't do, and wouldn't even presume to do, because I don't assume that I know any more about that than the people who are actually paid to give them the advice. I would say this. The NDP got up to over 30% in the last provincial election, and that's not unprecedented. It's a high number for them, but it's not unprecedented. I think in 43 they were the official opposition. They were again in 75. They were again in 87, and now they are again. So it's not, I mean, I think, what have we had? 43 elections. So you wouldn't say it's frequent that the NDP becomes the official opposition, but it's not unprecedented. What that party still seems not to have been able to do is to convince a sizable enough chunk of Ontarians that they are the government in waiting. Because all the public opinion polls I've seen lately coming out of Queen's Park have the NDP back in third place, and not a strong third. And that may be because most Ontarians, I don't think it's got anything to do with a hangover from Bob Rae of 30 years ago. I just, too much time's gone by. But there is a sense that we are still in the least dynamic province in the country when it comes to the roles that people assign to the three main parties. Now, look around the rest of Canada, Mitch. We've had new parties come and go all over the place and form governments, right? In Ontario, for 75 years, we've essentially had Liberals, Tories, New Democrats. I mean, the New Democrats were called something else, but for, the CCF for a little while. But okay, let's go back to the 60s. It's been more than 50 years. For more than 50 years, we have had the same three parties. And the Liberals and Tories overwhelmingly take turns being government, and the NDP got in once in 1990. And there seems to be a kind of, I'm not even sure what to call it here, but there is a permanence is the wrong word, because things can change, but there seems to be an expectation among the electorate that the Liberals and Tories are going to fight for government, and the NDP is going to be sort of the conscience of the legislature, and every now and then we'll let them get close. But their traditional spot is third place, and that's where they finish more often than not. Now, I don't know if you're advising Andrea Horwath, I'm not sure what you tell her to do to try to break that cycle. The fact of the matter is, she's doing all of the things opposition leaders are supposed to do when they have that job. She is offering constructive criticism to the government of the day. She is out there trying to, gain her piece of the spotlight. You may not like her ideas, for example, nationalizing all long-term care homes in the province of Ontario. It's a controversial idea. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions. She hasn't said how she'd fund it, other than to say that she hoped the federal government would pitch in and help make it happen. Is that the right way to go? I have no idea, but that's a defensible position that they're putting out there. So it's not like they've just thrown mud and haven't offered anything constructive. They have offered constructive alternatives. And yet there they are. I think the last poll I saw them in, they were down at 18%. So I understand the frustration at doing what you think is a good job and yet not being rewarded for it in the court of public opinion. And I don't know what to tell them about that. I just don't.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in, right? I think every political party, from my perspective, suffers from it's both a strength and a weakness. The people that are most likely to be in your ear as a political leader, as a politician, to be volunteering for you, knocking doors, giving you money, are often the most extreme's probably too far of a word, but the most ardent of your ideological position. And I think that it's hard to walk yourself away from being a sort of echo chamber for that voice, and I don't think the NDP is quite there right now, but I think in the past they've struggled from that a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see where they move coming forwards. But to this point in the podcast, as we sort of get to the last few questions, we've talked a lot about politics, and I think it's good as a table setter, especially with the legislature coming back. But we like to say that the podcast is about both politics and policy. So I want to talk a little bit more about that side of things. And you've done a lot of interesting work on the agenda and in your writing and in the podcast about the pandemic, obviously. And I'm curious as to someone who's covered it so closely. As we're sort of, and I'm using air quotes that the listeners can't see around the word hopefully, but as we're hopefully emerging from this pandemic, I'm curious what your thoughts are of the biggest challenges and biggest sort of systemic problems that it's exposed that governments of any stripe in Ontario would have to focus on, think about, and try to fix moving forwards.
Well, I'd answer that in two ways. Number one, the most obvious and pressing is how to figure out to reopen our schools safely. There is a great debate happening in the province of Ontario right now as to how you get 2 million young people back into schools, some of them 30 to a class, and do that safely. Safely not just for, obviously, the teachers and the employees in the school system, but also making sure those kids don't get sick and then bring whatever home to their parents and grandparents. I know the government says it has a plan. That plan has been sanctioned by the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Okay, let's see how it goes. Certainly the teacher unions and others in the education system have pointed out, their deep skepticism with the level of success they think that plan can have. Obviously we'll know soon enough. The other thing is, and Mitch, you've heard this expression, I'm sure lots, we're all in this together. We heard that, this pandemic doesn't care if you're rich or poor or young or old or, gay, straight, whatever. We're all in this together. Well, yes and no. And this is the other huge challenge governments are going to have going forward, which is, yes, to a certain extent, we're all in this together, but we're not all feeling the effects of this pandemic in the same way. And those who have means are able to avoid some of the worst ravages of it, either by going to cottages or being able to work from home or doing, other things that allow them to protect themselves from it. And there are others among us who simply can't do that, and if their job is working in a hospital or stocking shelves in a supermarket or driving a truck or, being a migrant worker on a farm, they are going to have a more difficult time protecting themselves from this disease than everybody else. So, yeah, we're all in it together, but let's not sugarcoat that. Let's not allow that expression to blind ourselves to the reality, which is that if you're poorer as opposed to richer, you're more vulnerable. Apparently, if you are from a visible minority community or an Indigenous community, you are more vulnerable than if you aren't. So we've got to look at this thing from a bunch of different metrics and not just sort of smugly and self-satisfyingly say we're all in it together. Because we are, but we're not really.
Mm-hmm. And I think as you focus on the problems that the pandemic has exposed or has created, it's important to keep that perspective, right? And one that strikes me is the fiscal picture. Obviously, both the federal and provincial governments and even municipal governments have spent a lot of money that they don't necessarily have, depending on who you ask. But regardless, it's a lot of money. It's billions and billions, and at the federal level, the debt is even in the trillion category for the first time. So, at some point, whether it's methodically over time or in a rapid fashion, these governments, including the provincial one, are going to have to refocus on spending, on balancing the budget, on what they do and don't tax. And I think keeping that perspective of who has been affected most directly is important when you think about that conversation. But what I'm really curious about from your perspective is knowing that this is coming at some point. It may not be this year, it may not be this month, it may be next mandate, but it's got to come at some point. You've seen a number of different provincial premiers attempt to tackle the books, get rid of big deficits, small deficits. Is there anyone who did it properly, who did it better than the others? And if so, what kind of characteristics of that review, of that sort of fiscal restraint and spending exercises, did they implement that just put them above the others?
Well, what an interesting question. And as you were saying it, I was thinking to myself, clearly the most able, most successful premier of our lifetimes was Bill Davis. 4 straight election wins. No one's done that in 100 years. A level of social cohesion that, we can only dream about today. Those days are certainly long gone. Now, mind you, there wasn't social media back then, but still, I was struck. I wrote a 600-page book on Bill Davis a couple of years ago, and what struck me about doing that book was how many people not from his party had such good things to say about him. So he managed to do politics in a way that made people feel included, including if you didn't vote for him or if you weren't a progressive conservative. Bill Davis never balanced a single budget. He was premier for 14 years. He never balanced a single budget. Now, admittedly, the debt to GDP when he left office was about 13%. So he knew how to run very modest deficits and run a very tight ship. The debt to GDP ratio in the province of Ontario today is not 13%. It's more like 49%, I believe, and will soon be over 50. So, for all the talk about he never balanced a budget, he certainly knew how to rein in spending as needs be. What are the lessons one takes from history here? Well, there have been very few over the last 50 years. You can count the number of balanced budgets in the last 50 years on not even all of the fingers of 2 hands. So it's not a frequent occurrence. And you're right, how we go from a $38.5 billion deficit today to balance sometime, 5, 7, 10 years down the road is a daunting challenge. How the feds are going to go from a $360 billion deficit back to balance whenever down the road is a daunting challenge. But at some point, it will have to be done. We're learning a lot these days about the importance of deficits and how meaningful they truly are or are not. I guess one of the things we've learned is, you can blow the deficit to smithereens if you want, provided you've run a fairly tight ship ahead of time and can afford to take on that kind of debt. We're lucky in that interest rates, unlike in Mr. Davis's time when they were as high as 20% at one point, they're next to nothing right now. So, but the province and the federal governments can borrow a lot of money, and the interest payments are not prohibitive as they were certainly back in his day. So these are all important things to know. I guess one lesson one takes from the Mike Harris era, and he got elected 25 years ago, a couple of months ago, is that he got into office, and I think within a matter of weeks, not months, but weeks, he had, and his finance minister, Ernie Eves, had managed to cut, I think, about $2.5 to $3 billion in spending. And I'm going to snap my fingers here, and I hope people can hear it, just like that. And I remember talking to the then Liberal Oakwood MPP Mike Cole, who had just got elected in 1995, having formerly been a Toronto City Councillor, which he is again now, funnily enough. And he said, it used to be that you couldn't put a stop sign up in my constituency without me knowing about it. And here it is, the province of Ontario just cut $3 billion in spending, and I had to read about it in the pages of the Toronto Star. I knew nothing about how they got there. So strike while the iron is hot, and then spend the next 3.5 years selling it. Seems to be a tried, tested, and true method. But, I'd turn the question back on you and say, no finance minister in our history has ever had to dig out of a hole this big. And the electorate right now, I mean, I'm sure you've seen polling on this. They don't care about the size of put it this way, they care about the size of the deficit, but not as much as they care about not getting sick and dying from COVID. So that's the tightrope that politicians are going to have to walk over the next decade.
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to look at it right now. Is it's not as much a question, right? If you're faced with spend the money and protect people, or don't spend it and face the consequences, you'll be spending the money. And I think to your point earlier in the podcast about the premier sort of navigating the pandemic so well. He managed to make that calculation, right, and made the proper one, I think, in almost everybody's view. So the one thing that's interesting about what the provincial governments managed to do is, though they have certainly spent money, they've managed to spend, as you put it, far less than the federal government has, right? They didn't get into necessarily individual income supports. They managed to kind of stay away from that so far. And so though 38 billion or whatever the number is going to end up being at the end of this fiscal year is a large number, it's actually far lower than it could have been. And I think that's hard to remind people of and hard to keep in perspective. But what I do
Well,
think,
Doug Ford's got the best line about that, right? He says, I haven't got the printing machine in the basement of Queen's Park. You know, the feds have that. And therefore and you know what? He's right. I mean, he doesn't control monetary policy. So it's certainly an argument he's been able to use to say we're being as generous as we can be, but, you know, even we have to pump the brakes from time to time.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, what I would say in terms of how do we get out of this moving forwards, or what is done next, is the one thing that concerns me is how many of the decisions are for the future to solve, right? So obviously the deficit is one. What are we going to do about that? But even if you break down those individual pieces that make up the deficit, I look at something as simple as the Fair Hydro Plan, the 25% electricity subsidy that was given to people that the Liberal government started in the Kathleen Wynne in the last few years of the Kathleen Wynne administration, but by all means the Ford government has continued. That's $5.6 billion a year.
Yep.
And there's no roadmap out of it. We haven't, the government hasn't put forward its plan to get out of the Fair Hydro Plan. Is it going to continue spending $5.6 billion a year, or is it going to rein that back? And I do think that, you know, day one of 2022, of the next mandate, whatever it might be, I think June 8th or June 9th of 2022, is going to be a particularly eye-opening day and a difficult day no matter who wins, whether it be the NDP, the Liberals, or the Conservatives. Again, I think they're going to be faced with a lot of tough decisions that they didn't want to make before an election or before a pandemic was over. And so, you know, an ideological approach, a philosophical approach, but a forthright approach about how to tackle those problems. And the last thing I'll say on it was, you know, to your point about striking while the iron's hot and sort of making the cuts and then standing there and defending them. I remember, you know, the 2019 budget, which obviously I played a big role in. We titled that "Protecting What Matters Most," and it was essentially that point. It was a justification for some of the spending decisions that have been made. But I kind of had a realization a few months after the budget was released that, you know, if it's called protecting what matters most, you may as well have called it attacking what matters least. Because,
well, it does point to something we talked about earlier. It does point back to authenticity and the trust that you have with your electorate and your ability to convince them that you've got a way forward. And I mean, let's just look. Dalton McGuinty, remember he won that election in 2003, of course you do, on the promise not to, you know, he said, I'm not going to cut your taxes, but I'm not going to raise them either. He got into office. Surprise, surprise, the deficit was bigger than he thought it was going to be. Surprise, surprise, not really. I think they knew, obviously. And, you know, here comes the Ontario Health Premium. Taxes did go up a lot. Now, he got reelected, right? He got reelected even though he broke his signature promise. And he did because somehow he managed to convince enough of the electorate that, you know, in his heart, he didn't want to do it, but he ended up having to do it because the alternatives were to keep that promise. I'm going to have to cut health and education, and you're not going to like that. So for whatever reason, he managed to make that sale. And 4 years later, he did it again, right? 4 years later, he brought in the HST. I don't think any government in the Western world had ever been reelected. I mean, go back to 1993, and you remember the federal Conservatives got obliterated down to 2 seats. Anybody that brings in significant tax policy have never been reelected in the history of Western governments. Well, McGuinty did. Now, this is not to say that his opponents didn't help him by making mistakes, but the reality is there was still a large enough chunk of the electorate that you know, he had built that bridge of trust with and had kept that bridge of trust. And I guess looking forward to 2022, the job that Doug Ford, if I can continue this metaphor, the job that he will need to do is to continue to convince people that he's got a plan, that he's for them, that, you know, you've trusted me so far to get us to where we are today. And, you know, let me finish the job. The job back then was defeating COVID. Hopefully 2 years from now, we've taken huge steps to do that. And the next huge mission, presumably by the next government of Ontario, will be, okay, we've got to figure out now how to deal with this massive debt and deficit and do it in a way that doesn't harm our current economy and that doesn't represent 200% tax increases for the next generations to come. That's a tall order. And, you know, whoever's going to be able to articulate that plan, I like their chances.
Yeah, I mean, I did have a last question on the script, which was something along the lines of, you know, what advice would you give to to party leaders or political parties is to.
Well, I don't give advice. You know that.
Yeah, to think about the next election. But I think that's a great answer to a question that I didn't even ask, which is, you got to keep your finger on the pulse, and you got to walk that balance between getting things in order and fixing sort of some of the underlying issues that have been exposed because of the pandemic, but doing so in a way that's responsible, that people can get on board with, right? And so that careful balance is something that I think you've talked about a lot with Bill Davis, so you've talked a lot about in your writings and in your work. So with that, Steve, a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for coming on the program.
Always a delight. Thanks a lot, Mitchell. Good talking to you.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.